My mother hates me because she thinks I scared away the lovers she had after she cheated on my father. When my mom cheated on my dad, I thought the worst was over. But after the divorce, living with her became a nightmare. Every failed relationship, every bottle of wine, every tear, she blamed me. I thought I ruined her life, but maybe she ruined mine first. I am 19M now, but let me take you back to when this mess of a family saga began. My mom, Leslie, 46F, and my dad, Jim, 48M, were a typical suburban couple, or so I thought as a kid. Dad was steady as a rock, the kind of guy who woke up at 5 a.m. every day for his warehouse job. Mom was different, always had a spark of energy that felt restless. I didn't understand why until I was older. When I was around 8, I started noticing things. Mom had friends who would visit when Dad was on night shifts. At the time, I didn't get the gravity of it. I'd hear them laughing in the living room, glasses clinking, while I was supposed to be asleep. But kids see more than adults think. Eventually, my dad found out. Let's just say it wasn't the cleanest breakup. It all came crashing down one night when my dad confronted her in the kitchen. I remember the sound of glass breaking, their voices rising until the walls felt like they were shaking. I was 9, hiding behind the staircase, too scared to move. My dad packed his bags that night, but not before trying to convince my mom one last time. He begged her for me. But she didn't care. The next morning, he was gone. No shouting, no goodbye. Just the empty smell of breakfast that never got made. Mom told me we were better off without him. But that wasn't true. In the following weeks, she cried a lot, drank even more, and started seeing a man I'd later learn was one of many. She won custody of me, and I wish she hadn't. After the divorce, my mom turned dating into a mission, as if finding the right man could fix everything that had broken in her life. At first, she seemed hopeful. She'd spend hours getting ready for dates, spraying on too much perfume, and humming songs from the 80s like she was back in high school. I'd sit on the couch watching her apply her makeup and wonder if this would finally be the man who stuck around. The first one I remember was Greg. He was a mechanic, always had oil-stained hands and smelled like motor grease. Mom giggled around him in a way that made me feel like I didn't know her anymore. They lasted 3 months, an eternity compared to the others. He left after an argument that I wasn't supposed to hear, but the walls were thin. Mom accused him of not trying hard enough. And he called her clingy, before slamming the door. Then came Daniel, who seemed different. He wore button-down shirts, worked in an office, and had this polite way of speaking that made me think he could be the one. He played chess with me once, just once, and I thought maybe things would be okay. But after a month, I stopped seeing his car in the driveway. I asked Mom what happened, and she brushed it off. He wasn't serious, she said. The pattern continued. There was Steve, who brought her flowers every week, but they wilted on the counter after he ghosted her. Tony, the guy who took us to the zoo once and never came back. Mark, who she dated for 2 months before she threw his clothes onto the lawn. Each man was a temporary fix, a bandage that couldn't cover the wound for long. With every breakup, Mom changed. The woman who used to hum songs and smile while cooking dinner became someone else entirely. After a breakup, she'd sit at the kitchen table, chain-smoking and sipping wine like it was water. Her gaze would be hollow, staring through me as if I weren't even there. But when the wine ran out, the sadness turned to rage. That's when she'd blame me. They leave because of you, you know, she told me one night after Steve disappeared. She slurred her words, but her voice carried a sharpness that cut straight through me. Men don't want to deal with someone else's kid. If I didn't have you, things would be different. She said that line so often it became her mantra. Whenever a relationship failed, it wasn't the man's fault, it was mine. To her, I was the constant obstacle, the reason she couldn't hold on to happiness. It got worse when she drank. Once, after Tony left, she came into my room in the middle of the night, swaying slightly, and sat on the edge of my bed. She stroked my hair, but her touch didn't feel comforting. It felt heavy. Do you know what you cost me? She whispered. I could have had a good life, but you tied me down. Every time I get close to something good, it slips away because of you. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made pancakes and smiled as if she hadn't crushed me the night before. I watched her repeat the cycle over and over. New man, new hope, then the inevitable crash. But as I got older, I noticed something. These men weren't leaving just because of me. They left because my mother was chasing something they couldn't give her, something that no one could. She wasn't looking for love, she was looking for salvation. But to her, I was the reason she couldn't find it. Eric wasn't just another boyfriend, he was different. For the first time, my mom seemed calmer, as if she believed she'd finally found the man who could fix everything. I'd catch her smiling while making dinner or humming softly while cleaning, a version of her I hadn't seen in years. But that calmness was fragile. When he left, everything shattered. That night, I heard her arguing with herself, pacing the kitchen with a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. She dialed his number over and over, only to slam the phone down each time he didn't answer. I kept my distance, sitting quietly in my room, hoping the storm would pass. But it didn't. She barged into my room, her face streaked with mascara and tears. "Do you know why he's gone?" she said, her voice trembling with fury. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. "Because of you," she spat. "No man wants to deal with a kid who isn't theirs. I've given up everything for you, and what do I have to show for it?" She left before I could respond, slamming the door behind her. I sat in silence, the words settling in like they belonged there. After Eric, her dating slowed down, but her drinking didn't. The bottles multiplied, and the smell of wine clung to her like a second skin. Our home became quieter, no laughter, no conversations, just the sound of her glass being refilled. The truth was, I didn't fear the yelling anymore. I feared the silence. When she stopped shouting and locked herself in her room for days, that's when I knew things were worse. I tried knocking on her door once, asking if she needed anything. Her answer was simple. "Leave me alone." I obeyed. I always did. By the time I was 14, I stopped waiting for things to get better. I didn't believe in better anymore. If there was any relief in my life, it was the weekends I spent with my dad. He didn't have much, just a small apartment with outdated furniture and an old TV that barely worked. But it felt like a palace compared to the chaos at home. He wasn't the type to lecture or pry. Instead, he let me exist without the weight of judgment. We'd fish at the local pond, eat burgers at the same greasy diner, and work on small projects around his apartment. He wasn't a man of many words, but he didn't need to be. His presence was enough. Whenever I visited, I could breathe again. He'd hand me a screwdriver and teach me how to fix a leaky faucet or hang a new picture frame. I always thought it was just his way of passing time, but looking back, I realized those small lessons were his way of giving me stability, something to hold on to when everything else felt like quicksand. He never asked why I didn't want to go home on Sunday nights, but I think he knew. Once, while packing my bag, he stopped and looked at me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You know you can tell me if something's wrong, right?" I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't tell him. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't want to burden him. I knew he had fought for custody and lost. Bringing up my mother's anger would only make him feel like he'd failed me again. Instead, I told him everything was fine. And he believed me, or at least pretended to. The car rides back to my mom's house were the hardest. The closer we got, the more I felt the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. Sometimes, I'd catch my dad glancing at me in the rearview mirror, like he was debating whether to turn the car around and take me back with him. But he never did. He couldn't. When I'd step through the front door, the smell of stale wine and cigarette smoke would greet me, along with her cold, distant stare. The weekends with my dad felt like a dream that dissolved the moment I returned. But those weekends gave me something my mother couldn't: hope. Hope that one day, I could leave and build a life that wasn't controlled by her bitterness or haunted by her failed relationships. I just had to survive long enough to get there. By the time I turned 17, my mother's relationships were no longer romantic. They were survival tactics. She clung to men like they were lifeboats, trying to stay afloat in a sea of her own making. That's when she met Kevin. Kevin was different, at least at first. He was older, more stable, and didn't seem to mind that she had a teenage son. He had a good job, dressed well, and even brought flowers on his first visit. I remember thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe she's found someone who won't run away. For the first 6 months, things were peaceful. She drank less, stopped yelling, and even made dinner some nights like she used to when I was a kid. Kevin would joke with me at the table, ask me about school, and for a moment, I almost felt like we were a normal family. but cracks appeared quickly. I could see it in the way she clung to him, texting constantly, questioning where he was, and accusing him of not caring enough when he didn't respond. One night, I overheard them arguing in the living room. "I'm not your therapist, Leslie," Kevin said, exasperated. "You can't keep unloading on me and expect me to fix everything." "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she shouted. "I just need you to stay." But Kevin didn't stay. A week later, he left, just like the rest of them. I came home from school to find my mother sitting on the couch, staring at the wall with an untouched glass of wine in front of her. She didn't even notice me walk in. I thought she would explode, like she had after all the others. But this time was different. This time, she was silent. She stayed in that daze for days, barely eating or speaking. When she finally snapped out of it, she didn't yell or throw anything. Instead, she came into my room late one night, sat at the edge of my bed, and said something I'll never forget. "You were right. I scared them away. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm broken." For the first time, she didn't blame me. But instead of relief, I felt something worse, guilt. I'd spent so long wishing she'd see the truth, but hearing her admit it felt like watching her collapse under the weight of it all. She got up and left my room without waiting for a response, and I lay there, wondering if she was finally at the point of no return. The next morning, she acted like the conversation never happened. But I couldn't forget. Kevin was her final attempt at love, and when that failed, so did the last shred of hope she had. After Kevin left, my mother didn't try to date again. It was like she'd finally given up on the idea of love altogether. She stopped wearing makeup, stopped caring about how the house looked, and spent most of her time on the couch, binge-watching TV with a glass of wine permanently glued to her hand. The blame didn't stop, though. If anything, it got worse. But it was quieter now, like background noise I couldn't escape. "I could have been happy if I didn't have you," she'd say casually, as if it were a fact as simple as the weather. "I wouldn't be stuck in this house if you weren't born." By then, the words didn't sting the way they used to. I'd heard them too many times. I stopped reacting, which seemed to frustrate her even more. When she couldn't get a rise out of me, she'd retreat to the kitchen, open another bottle of wine, and mutter to herself about how I'd ruined her life. But there was one person she never blamed: my dad. To her, he was the man who got away, the one who could have saved her if only he hadn't left. She talked about him sometimes, reminiscing like they'd had the perfect marriage, conveniently forgetting that she was the one who destroyed it. I hated hearing her rewrite history, but I never corrected her. It wasn't worth the fight. Instead, I focused on my future. I threw myself into school, got a part-time job, and saved every dollar I could. College wasn't just a goal, it was my escape plan. Every time she slurred out an insult or broke down in tears, I reminded myself that I only had to endure it a little longer. One night, as I was studying in my room, she knocked on the door. I hesitated before opening it. She stood there, glass in hand, swaying slightly. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "You can't wait to leave and forget about me." I didn't answer. She was right. "Just don't come crawling back when life gets hard," she said before turning and stumbling down the hall. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just bitter, she was scared. Scared of being alone, scared of being forgotten. But I couldn't let that fear trap me. I had to leave, even if it meant leaving her behind, and I did. The day I turned 18, I packed my bags and left for college. She didn't come to see me off. I don't know if she couldn't or if she just didn't care. Either way, I didn't look back. Now, at 19, I'm a year into college, and my relationship with my mother is exactly what I expected, strained and distant. We speak occasionally, mostly when she calls to rant about her bills or complain that no one checks on her anymore. She never asks how I'm doing, and I've stopped expecting her to. Last week, during one of those calls, she said something that hit me harder than I expected. "You think you're free now, don't you? But you'll always carry me with you." I didn't respond. She wasn't wrong. Her voice, her blame, the years of resentment, they linger in the back of my mind, no matter how far I run. But I also know something else. I don't have to be trapped by it anymore. I have my dad, who still checks in regularly, offering advice and support without needing anything in return. And I have myself, a version of me she tried to break but couldn't. Maybe she's right that I'll always carry some of her with me. But the difference now is, I get to decide how much space she takes up in my life. I won't let her consume me anymore. The last time she blamed me for ruining her life, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel the need to fix it. I simply told her, "That's not my burden to carry." For the first time, she was the one left in silence.